So before we go on with the more complex plugins, or rather slightly less simple plugins, slightly more complex plugins, not like complex plugins that will do like a million things, but just slightly more complex. And by that I mean something like fancy maps that has a little bit of interaction. So you enter a location or you pick from a popular destination, and then maybe you can enter an input, and then basically some sort of interaction. With these days, the way such things are built is by using reactive UI development. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a way to produce UI as a function of state. What that means is, instead of saying document query select something and then show or hide or set text or text content is equal to something, you basically specify the state. So for instance here you'll see this React example here. It basically says this.state.seconds, and then the seconds are what will show here on the right, and then after every second they're just increasing that second by 1. So yeah, it's instead of every time coming in and say add an ID to this div here, and then after 1 second change its content inside, you can just specify now the new state is the new state seconds is maybe 322, or add it after every second. Then the UI framework does the magic of updating the relevant parts. So it's actually quite popular these days. With iOS they are using it in SwiftUI. SwiftUI is the new way of making iOS and Mac and iPad apps. So yeah, they're using reactive UI development now using SwiftUI. With Android SDK, they're using something called Jetpack Compose. It's basically the same thing too. They're using reactive development instead of manually changing the content. There's Flutter, which works in both iOS and nowadays even in desktops and browsers. So yeah, again you'll see here they are storing some sort of state. Let's see if I can see the state here. Where is the state? It's somewhere hidden. It's not being shown in this particular editor here, but yeah, when you click this button it basically just increases the state, the count here in the UI. Flutter behind the scenes does the magic of updating the UI or the relevant parts that have changed. So yeah, that's Flutter. And then obviously I was showing you React. There's something new called Aurelia. It's a JavaScript framework. You could go check that out too. And then if you're doing PHP and Laravel, there's something called Livewire. Again, applies the same concept. So here you see you have a view mode, wire mode, where if you change something in the input, it will update somewhere in the UI. So yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is reactive UI development is the way forward. So now when I was working on fancy maps, my obvious choice was to use React because I've been using React for a while. But it just felt a little bit of an overkill, and I didn't like that I had to do some sort of bundling situation on top of this, because I felt like the plugin was a little bit less complex than what I would use to make React. So what I did, and this is gonna sound crazy, but what I did is I made my own simple UI framework. And by simple I mean it just simply uses document query selector. It doesn't do any fancy things. So my reasoning being that I was not trying to cover every particular scenario that would ever happen in the world. So something like React supports native apps. It supports 3JS if you want to support. It supports like many things. My point, that is the point of React or something like Vue. But in my case, I knew I was going to use it for XD plugins, so I made it like a little bit simplistic. So obviously, a little bit of a disclaimer here: if you're going to use this, I wouldn't recommend it for super large apps, because in that case you're probably better off going with React. If you but I'm not saying that it wouldn't make sense, but I'm just saying it's not been optimized to do that. It's intended to do simple 2, 3, maybe 5 pages plugins. And yeah, of course, if you're happy with doing the whole bid step thing, again, you could totally go with the React way. React has XD has fantastic support for React, so yeah, you could definitely go that way. So that being said, like I said, I was heavily inspired by Alpine, and by heavily inspired I mean that this guy has a tutorial on how he made Alpine that I went through one day when I was looking for something to learn, and this is actually really cool. So when the need arose when I was working on fancy maps, I was like, you know what, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to try and see if I can make my own solution. So yeah, and then also you'll notice in the plugin I'll be using things like X dash. So something like X dash or show or X at click is something I'm using in that little framework I made. So like I said, heavily inspired by these guys. You can go and check out this. This is actually a fantastic sort of behind the scenes. If you're not in the UI framework development world, if you're not contributing to a UI framework, this is a fantastic way to get started. Yeah, so that's basically it. I was telling you the other day in the intro videos that I like using the forums. So something I actually found out when I was working on the plugin is I needed to use eval, but I couldn't actually use it, so because of security reasons. So there's a solution. When I looked through the forums for the solution, I got this something called sval right here, and yeah, so this is just one of the examples of how many times I've actually had to refer to the forums for answers. So this is definitely something you'll need to get familiar with and make use of. Yeah, that being said, I'm going to show you a little bit of the template I'll be working with for the plugin. Going forward, this is what we're going to use as a getting started tool. So it's basically the same setup as before. If you copied the normal XD plugin, it will need a show and update, and obviously this will be mapped to the function the call in your manifest.json. So the UI entry point, the panel ID is what you're going to call this point here. So if you had multiple panels, you could probably have something else here. So now that we've seen that, now this is probably, you're looking at this and you're probably thinking this doesn't look anything like the XD example, and that's because I've moved the UI logic into UI/index here. So in UI/index, I'm actually exporting those two functions, show and update, and what the show does is it just simply creates the panel content if it's not been created yet. You see I'm checking if there's no panel, and panel is just a global variable set up here. And then I'm also calling the update method, and now you'll notice now something is different here. It says UI.setState instead of maybe doing some manual document selector thing. And so what it does, it just comes to the UI. The state here starts off with an array of selected items. Some of the things that you would interact most times with is selected items. So the example is set up to use but this can be anything. You could be tracking anything, and again, like I said, you don't really need to go this route. I'm just showing this to you in case you're curious and you'd like to go this direction. So yeah, so it starts off with an array of selected items, which is empty by default, and then when the plugin is updated, or rather when the user selects something on the plugin, it updates that array with the selection.items. If you've gone through my previous tutorials, you're already very familiar with selection.items, I'm hoping. Other than that, it creates this node. So when it does creating, it sets up the panel by creating a div as a wrapper. This is actually something interesting you should probably know. Without this, I'm hoping you've seen this in my previous videos, but in case you haven't, this is just a simple string interpolation. I'm just using this fantastic plugin here called, let me see if I can find it for you guys. ES6 string HTML. This is what actually helps me to have to add a comment here and make this content inside here not look like just a normal string but have this syntax highlighting. It allows me to also do this, but for some reason XD doesn't work with named template literals. So the good news is at least the plugin, the VS Code plugin I was just showing you, allows me to actually add a comment instead. So yeah, and now this is the first code, the UI framework. So in case you're curious, you'll find this code in a repository I'm setting up. I have set up rather. So if I can show it to you here, it's just tracks at XD plugins. I think that's what I'm calling it. Yeah, so you'll find it here. You find the plugin template here, and you'll see there's all these sorts of things here. So the framework is inside UI and UI framework. You can't miss it. Obviously I don't have a name for it yet, so it's just called UI framework. Yeah, so all it does is receives the root node there and some methods, sets up event listeners. If you can look at this, maybe you might. So you'll see it just looks for Xmodo at click, and at submit, and at load is basically if you want to submit a form, if you click something, and if a page loads up, maybe that's something you want to know. And then it just uses the evaluate function I created using SVal here, and this uses SVal. Again, you can just go through this code and hit me up if you're curious. Maybe you could hit me up, and then I'll make a separate video on how this UI framework works, in case you either want to contribute to it or you want to do your own thing. Just hit me up, and then I'll tell you how this works. It's actually quite straightforward. You'll see I'm using a lot of document query sectors. That being said, you should probably know the actual frameworks don't do a lot of this query select at all. They are doing something much more optimized. So this is something you want to be aware of. My argument was I was going to do this anyway, and I'm not going to have a UI with 500 nodes. So for me, it just felt like unnecessary thing to go and learn how to optimize it. I might go and learn it later on, but right now I didn't feel like excuse me, like I needed to do that. So I just went with the ordinary document query selector, so yeah. So if you look at how the framework, the UI works now, you'll see I'm doing something like let me show you this template in action. So it's basically this. So by default there is my awesome plugin as a title there. Okay, something you need to see also, again, I'm hoping this is something you've seen in my previous tutorials, but in case you haven't, again, I have the CSS here. And if you haven't used Tailwind or another utility framework, you should probably give it a look. It might not be for you, but it's something worth taking a look at. Because for me it's a really nice way to build UIs, at least for me. Again, like I said, it might not work for you, but I really like building UIs using utilities like this instead of just like the Bootstrap style. Nothing wrong with Bootstrap. I've used and enjoyed Bootstrap for a while, but for somebody who likes to write CSS like myself, I prefer this atomic style thing where I can compose, and actually gives you responsive things. Like you see AMD flex, so it's only flex on medium and up. So yeah. Now you'll see I'm using a lot of these utilities in here. So like the PX is horizontal padding, and MX will be horizontal margin, Mauto would be margin out, like that. So yeah. So yeah, you see MB3 means the margin bottom 3. Now it doesn't mean 3 pixels. I think I've heard this online, so I'll probably have to clarify. It just uses a scale. Again, look into Tailwind. You might not have to use it, but you'll definitely get some things to maybe to be inspired by. So check it out. It's very cool. So yeah, now I'm importing this CSS here in my panel HTML. And then so with something like fancy maps, I wouldn't put this HTML here. I would probably put it in a separate HTML file. I don't know if I have it open here. I could try and show it to you. Let me see. Yeah, so I think this is it, the UI. So you'll notice again I have the CSS there, and I have the fancy map wrapper, the app itself, and then I have pick screen and customize screen. So the pick screen is the first screen where you're actually picking a location. Here, sorry, not that. Here, where you can pick surprise destination or enter or pick from a location, and then the customize screen is this next screen here. So yeah, we have pick screen, customize screen, and then you have something like a loader. If you're not selected anything, you'll get this message, empty state message, and also which is the warning, and you'll also get a loader here, something like that. So yeah, so you see now, like I said, I'm going to I've put this screen separately, so this can go as complex as you want it to, or you could put everything there. I know that some people don't like having this file split. I like having them split because they can help me focus on the logic in a single place. So yeah, moving on. So yeah, so you'll notice now I have my awesome plugin there. If I can go back to the plugin template here, so you have the title, and then this says show if selected items.length, which means it will only show this error message here if there's no selected items. So if I select, you'll see the message comes in, please select an item to get started. If I select an item, I get the items there. So yeah, if I unselect this guy, so yeah, that is being done by expanded index. So after I see, the first thing I do is to list the selected items. So if I selected multiple, here you'll see there's a boolean group. If I selected something else, there's a rectangle. If I select maybe a text, you'll see a text there. And then I'm doing something when I click an item. So you'll see here, I'd event listen a click. When I click an item, it will show me the expanded item. What I'm doing is just simply saying the expanded index is equal to index, which is the index of that item in the array of selected items. So yeah. And then when I click clear selection, what it does is simply reset the expanded index to -1, and then that way we don't see anything expanded here. Yeah, so that's basically how this works. This is like a very simplistic version of it, but I deliberately covered most of the things you'd need to do with it. So you'll see here I'm also using a dynamic class based on if the item is selected. So you notice if an item is selected, it changes the background and color. So that is being done here. Again, I'm using utilities for the background and text. Yeah. So yeah, this is basically how we're going to be building plugins going forward. So yeah, hopefully this is helpful with the next tutorials coming after this, and hopefully you join me in the next tutorials and are not intimidated, because I promise this is not in any way complex. With the next tutorials, I'll be stripping everything down and starting from scratch, so you'll get to see me build, and hopefully it will make you at least a little bit aware of what is happening. I'm showing you an example of something that has been completely done already, which might not be the easiest to follow along through unless you actually take time to read through the code, which is quite straightforward. Yeah, so until next time, cheers.